You are not walking, but being carried forward by history itself, though. Your feet wrapped in thin slippers of borrowed silk make no sound on the polished marble floors. The year is 1520. Outside the palace walls of Istanbul, cannons thunder and merchants haggle in the bazaar. But here in the labyrinth of Topkapi, silence reigns. The hush is deliberate, a silence designed not for peace but for power, as though the walls themselves listen and record. The older woman beside you, her robes heavy with embroidered tulips, her eyes trained to betray nothing, leans close. She whispers in your ear, her breath scented faintly of rosewater. What she tells you now will decide whether you survive the coming months or vanish one more unmarked grave in the gardens beyond these walls. You glance around. The hallways rise higher than any cathedral you've known. Blue and white Iznik tiles climb the walls like frozen gardens, their curves and floral motifs dazzling under the flicker of oil lamps. Inlaid calligraphy curls overhead verses of devotion reminding all who enter that God watches even here in the secret corridors of desire. The air is thick with frankincense and honeyed smoke masking the more human smells of fear and sweat that cling to the women who pass through. Your heart pounds though you try to keep your face still. The palace demands masks long before it demands service. The old woman's whisper sharpens. These are not mere customs, child. They are chains. They bind tighter than iron, though you will never see them. They bind your breath, your smile, even your dreams. She glances toward a bronze lattice window through which faint dawn light creeps. Somewhere beyond it lies the Bosphorus, glittering with ships that carry the Empire's wealth. But for you, the Empire is reduced to these corridors and the rules she is about to recite. The path narrows each step, bringing you closer to the core of the palace. The harem, the word that outsiders imagine as paradise, but insiders know as a prison gilded in lapis and jade. The very architecture teaches submission. Doors open inward, never outward, as if reminding those who enter that escape is not part of the design. Courtyards bloom with fountains, yet even their water is regimented, falling in measured rhythm, echoing the order imposed on every soul inside. You see shadows flicker. Eunuchs guard the intersections, their black robes blending with stone. Their eyes give away nothing, but you feel their scrutiny as though weighed on scales. To them you are not a person, but an entry in a ledger, another piece of property to be scheduled, trained, and if necessary discarded. The elder continues, every corner here hides eyes. Every whisper echoes further than you think. Forget freedom, forget chance. What governs your knights are rules older than you rules written, to keep the Sultan untouchable and you invisible. Her voice lowers still more, as though the tiles themselves might betray her. Do not mistake beauty for power. Beauty is only the bait that drew you here. What keeps you alive are obedience, silence, and memory. You swallow hard. The incense clings to your throat, sweet and suffocating. In the distance you hear a faint note of music, perhaps a flute, but it fades too quickly to offer comfort. The palace is alive with sounds that never belong to you. Chants in the courtyards, footsteps behind walls, muffled sobs that vanish into the stone. For the first time, the enormity of your captivity becomes clear. You are not merely entering a palace, you are stepping into a system perfected over centuries, one that uses desire as a weapon, turning women's bodies into tools of policy and intimacy into an illusion. The old woman's words settle like iron in your chest. Invisible chains, she calls them, and as you glance at the lattice windows and the gilded arches above, you realize they are already tightening. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from, and what hour has the night brought you? Stop. The first rule you learn is the one that feels most cruel in its simplicity. No woman, no matter how beloved, was ever permitted to remain in the Sultan's bed after dawn. The moment his breathing deepened into sleep, the concubine at his side was required to slip silently from the silken sheets, gather her garments in the darkness, and disappear down the guarded corridors. By sunrise the chamber would be empty, as though the night itself had been erased. This was no idle custom. It was law, ancient, unbending, enforced with the severity of empire. The guards stationed outside the chamber doors did not sleep. Their task was to note the moment the concubine emerged to ensure no woman lingered even a heartbeat too long. If dawn's first light revealed a figure still beside the Sultan, punishment was not scolding or exile, but death swift and merciless. For the Ottomans to remain through morning was to threaten the balance of power itself. The logic was cold. Overnight companionship meant pillow talk, and pillow talk meant influence. A single whispered suggestion, a carefully planted word spoken in the softness of midnight, could alter the empire's decisions. Campaigns might be delayed. Generals dismissed alliances, destroyed, all because one woman held the Sultan's ear when his guard was lowered. To prevent that, the harem imposed this absolute barrier between pleasure and intimacy. Imagine the loneliness it produced. Women chosen for their beauty and skill, trained to sing, dance, and recite poetry, were granted a few hours of closeness only to be cast back into solitude before dawn. They became like shadows in his life, present at night, erased by day. Even if affection began to bloom, it was severed by ritual before it could take root. For the women, the law was a sentence of endless half-love relationships built only on fragments of time, never whole. It was not a uniquely Ottoman cruelty. History shows that across empires, rulers sought to sever desire from influence. In ancient Rome, emperors kept consorts at arm's length, fearing that a whisper in bed might outweigh the council of senators. In imperial China, the Forbidden City operated on a similar rotation system. Concubines carefully cycled in and out of the emperor's bedchamber to prevent any single woman from holding sway. The Ottomans, however, perfected the method with a brutality sharpened by centuries, not only forbidding intimacy, but erasing even the illusion of permanence. The result was a palace where affection itself became dangerous, where longing for more than a few hours could cost a woman her life. Each concubine knew that dawn was not a promise of renewal but a threat. The guards at the threshold became the arbiters of survival, and the light filtering through the lattice windows was not freedom's glow but the signal of exile from warmth. The elder woman's words echo in your mind as you hear this rule for the first time in visible chains. Here was one of the heaviest. The Sultan's chamber might be a place of velvet cushions and perfumed lamps, but it was also a prison cell with a revolving door. And every woman who crossed its threshold knew she was allowed to share only the Sultan's night, never his morning. For centuries, the rule of no night until morning was ironclad, a ritual no one dared test. Yet in the year 1520, a young woman from the wind-swept steppes of Ukraine shattered it with a single act of audacity. Her name was Roxolana to the Europeans, but in the palace, she would be known as Hurrem the Joyful One. She had entered the harem not as a willing bride, but as a captive taken in a Tatar raid and delivered through slave markets to Istanbul. By all logic, she should have been one more anonymous face among the hundreds of concubines, another ornament in the Sultan's treasury of beauty. But Hurrem possessed something rarer than beauty, a disarming wit, a quick mind, and the courage to risk death where others clung to survival. The story is told that on her first true night with Sultan Suleiman, she did what no woman before her had dared. When his breathing softened, signaling sleep, she did not rise. She did not slip away into the corridors. She remained. Through the long hours, as the embers of the lamps dimmed and the night stretched into pale dawn, she lay beside him. By morning light, when the guards expected an empty chamber, they found her still there, alive and smiling. By all precedent, this should have been her end. The law was clear. Dawn with the Sultan meant execution. But instead of outrage, something astonishing happened. Suleiman, already known for his sharp intellect and unusual independence, did not demand her removal. He did not summon the executioner. He allowed her to stay. The shock rippled through the harem like an earthquake. Senior concubines, women who had played by the rules for decades, seethed. The Valide Sultan Suleiman's mother and the supreme authority of the harem was affronted. If one woman could defy the dawn rule, then the entire lattice of discipline and hierarchy might collapse. Yet Suleiman, the man history would call the magnificent, was not easily swayed by tradition. When his mind or heart leaned otherwise, why did he allow it? Part of the answer lies in Hurrem herself. Unlike many concubines trained to silence, she was quick with laughter, fluent in charm and daring in conversation. She entertained Suleiman not only with her body, but with her mind, composing witty verses and answering his riddles. Some sources suggest that in her he saw not just a concubine, but a confidant, a rarity in a palace designed to keep women voiceless. But the other half of the answer lies in Suleiman's personality. Though a man of empire, he was also a poet, a dreamer who wrote under the pen name Muhib. He valued intellect and emotional connection as much as ceremony. Where another sultan might have crushed Hurrem for her defiance, Suleiman indulged her, perhaps even admired her boldness. The harem hierarchy, however, erupted. Older concubines demanded her punishment, fearing their own authority would be eroded. Whispered accusations of witchcraft and manipulation spread as though no natural woman could bend the sultan's will. Young women, meanwhile, looked at Hurrem with wonder. Did this mean the rules could be broken? Could dawn belong to them as well? The truth was harsher. For most, the law remained unyielding, but for Hurrem, dawn became the first step toward a revolution. She had not merely stayed the night, she had rewritten the balance of power between ruler and concubine. In the marble chambers of Topkapi, where chains were meant to remain invisible and unbreakable, she had found the first crack. If the dawn rule severed intimacy before it could grow, the second rule severed it just when it blossomed. It was called the one concubine, one son law, and its cruelty lay in its paradox. For a woman in the Ottoman Harem, bearing a son was the pinnacle of success, yet it was also the end of her closeness with the Sultan. The moment a concubine delivered a male child, her role changed forever. She was no longer lover, no longer a figure of nightly rotation, but became the mother of a prince, a title heavy with honour and even heavier with consequence. She was moved to separate apartments within the palace complex, richly decorated and far larger than before, but also deliberately distant from the Sultan's chambers. Her days of tender nights were finished. Her power now flowed not from affection, but from the tiny heartbeat of the boy she had borne. The logic was as clear as it was cold. By ensuring that each concubine could give the Sultan only one son, the Ottomans curbed the possibility of any single woman monopolizing the ruler's love. It was a safeguard against dynastic chaos. A harem where one favorite bore multiple sons risked bloody succession wars with brothers raised in the same household, turning swords upon each other. By dividing maternity, the system spread the empire's heirs across many mothers, balancing influence, and keeping the throne from becoming hostage to one woman's womb. This strategy echoed other dynasties, though each had its own version. In the Ming palaces of China, emperors cycled through women with equal rigour, limiting any one consort's chance to build lasting dominance. In the Mughal courts of India, the emperor's wives and mothers wielded vast political power, but jealousy and factional struggles often tore families apart. The Ottomans believed they had found a solution and restrict intimacy, multiply mothers and tether women's fates to a single son. Yet for the women themselves, the law was devastating. To carry the Sultan's child was to trade romance for politics. The warm glances, the carefully rehearsed nights, the fragile intimacy of shared hours all ended the moment a boy's cry filled the chamber. From that day forward, the woman became a political actor. Her life centered not on desire, but on the survival and advancement of her son. She received gifts, servants, apartments adorned with the finest Iznik tiles, yet in those luxuries lay exile. Bittersweet does not begin to capture it. Many women longed for a son, knowing it would secure their safety and elevate their rank. But once it happened, they mourned the loss of the very intimacy that had brought them to power. They watched from their distant quarters as other women took their place at the Sultan's side, while they themselves receded into the role of strategist advisor and protector of their child's fragile future. The harem was designed this way to turn love into duty, and to ensure that for every woman who reached the height of triumph there was also the sting of permanent separation. Affection once again became not reward but liability, cut away with the precision of law. If a son ended intimacy, a daughter prolonged it. For women in the harem, bearing a girl meant they could remain in the Sultan's rotation, their chambers still within reach of his. The birth of a daughter preserved their access, their chance to whisper poetry in the dark, their fragile hold on affection. Yet what seemed like a reprieve was a reprieve laced with terror. Every night with the Sultan carried a hidden gamble. A daughter might secure months or years of continued closeness, but a son welcomed by the empire as an heir was for the mother a sentence of removal. The irony was suffocating. To give the empire what it craved most was to lose the one thing a concubine most desired, her place in the Sultan's heart. This knowledge bred a strange and anxious form of strategy. Women who had tasted intimacy and feared its loss began to calculate, to scheme not against rivals but against their own fertility. Herbal knowledge passed in whispers became as valuable as jewels. Midwives and older concubines taught methods to delay conception, potions brewed from rue pomegranate rind or pennyroyal, rituals of timing and withdrawal, practices that turned the female body into a battlefield of deliberate sabotage. Every decision, whether to drink an infusion, whether to feign illness, was weighed against the possibility of bearing a son and being banished to distant quarters. Ottoman records hint at this quiet war. Palace physicians noted the curious prevalence of herbal remedies among women who otherwise lived in opulence. Court gossip spoke of concubines who fasted claiming piety, but whose true aim was to weaken the cycles of fertility. It was a silent rebellion fought not with daggers but with root seeds and calendars. Yet this strategy was perilous. A woman who failed to produce any child risked obscurity and dismissal, while one who bore only daughters could be accused of inadequacy. Between these dangers lay a razor's edge of survival. Some concubines prayed for girls' others for barrenness itself, knowing either path might let them cling to the Sultan a little longer. The body became more than flesh. It became currency, a ledger of risks and returns. To outsiders, the harem glittered with jewels and silks. Inside it was a place where every heartbeat of the womb carried political weight, where the simplest act of conception was both triumph and tragedy. The anxiety that shadowed these women was relentless, an invisible chain tighter than any guard's grip. They smiled when summoned, painted in lead-based powders and perfumed with rosewater. But beneath those smiles lay the gnawing calculation: would tonight be the night their body betrayed them, with the sun ending forever? The fragile thread of closeness they had fought so carefully to preserve. Before a woman could ever cross the threshold of the Sultan's chamber, she was forced to endure what the palace delicately called purity tests. The word suggested ritual and dignity, but in practice these examinations were invasive, humiliating, and coldly pragmatic. Conducted by senior midwives and overseen by eunuchs, they stripped away privacy as efficiently as they stripped away identity. Virginity was of course the first measure, but it did not end there. Midwives inspected body proportions with almost mathematical scrutiny: the curve of hips, the symmetry of features, the clarity of skin. They checked teeth, breath, even the sound of laughter, as if the smallest imperfection might one day disturb the Sultan's peace. Most chilling of all were the tests for sleep behaviour. Candidates were observed at night to see if they snored, talked in their dreams, or shifted restlessly. A single murmur in sleep could disqualify a woman forever, for the Sultan's slumber was treated as sacred to disturb it, and you were considered a threat. It was less a medical process than a ritual of control, echoing the darker superstitions of the medieval world. In Europe, a woman accused of impurity might be thrown into water to see if she sank or floated, a trial by ordeal, masquerading as divine judgment. In the Ottoman palace, the ordeal was quieter, but no less cruel: an army of hands and eyes probing every detail of a woman's body, as though anatomy alone could predict loyalty or worth. Underlying these tests were medical beliefs we now call superstition. Physicians of the age still spoke of humours: blood phlegm, bile-shaping temperament, and fertility. A pale complexion might be read as weakness of blood, a restless sleeper as evidence of a disordered spirit. These pseudosciences justified the intrusions, turning women into living specimens to be categorized and sorted. Imagine the psychological toll. To stand unclothed under the gaze of strangers, your breath measured your limbs, prodded your fate determined by whether you twitched in slumber. This was the initiation into the Sultan's world. From the very beginning, women were taught that their bodies were not their own. They were instruments of empire, examined with the same detachment a merchant might show a prize horse. Some women never recovered from the indignity. Rejected candidates were reassigned to menial palace work, kitchen service, laundry, caretaking, marked for life as unfit for intimacy. Those who passed the ordeal were told to be grateful, yet even they carried the memory of the hands that inspected them, the whispered judgments, the knowledge that survival here depended not on who they were, but on how perfectly their bodies could be shaped into someone else's design. This was the gate of the harem. Not a jewelled archway, but a corridor of examinations where humanity was stripped away piece by piece, replaced by the cold calculations of an empire that saw love not as a gift, but as a risk to be managed. If the harem was built to impose order, then one ruler's madness revealed just how fragile that order could be. In the 1640s, Sultan Ibrahim, remembered by history as Ibrahim, the Mad, twisted the system into grotesque shapes that bore little resemblance to its original logic. His reign is still whispered about in Ottoman chronicles, not only for political instability, but for the bizarre obsessions that warped the very architecture of his chambers. The most infamous began with a hunting trip. Ibrahim became fixated on the body of a cow, so enthralled by its form that he ordered golden replicas of its anatomy to be made. These objects were dispatched across the empire with chilling instructions. Every governor was to find women whose bodies matched the model exactly. Imperial agents carrying these golden moulds like sacred relics travelled from Anatolia to Armenia, from Syria to the Balkans, measuring women as if they were livestock at a market. The search ended with a 3-pound Armenian woman named Maria. Renamed Shivakar Sultan and installed at the heart of the harem, she was celebrated by Ibrahim as his ideal companion. In her elevation, hundreds of others had been measured, humiliated, and discarded. living evidence of how quickly personal obsession could become state decree. But Ibrahim's eccentricities did not end there. He developed a mania for animal furs, as believing they heightened his strength and virility. Leopard skins, wolf pelts, even rare sable were torn from the empire's far corners to line his chambers. Persian carpets gave way to pelts nailed into walls, silk cushions replaced with hides. Visitors spoke of rooms transformed into macabre menageries where the scent of musk and death clung to every corner. These extravagances might be dismissed as the quirks of one disturbed man, yet they had real consequences for the empire. Ibrahim's demands drained the treasury at a time when the Ottoman state was already faltering. Tax burdens on peasants grew heavier, trade faltered, and foreign powers mocked the once feared sultans as weak and decadent. The harem, once a symbol of disciplined control, became instead the stage of a ruler's unravelling. Court officials, terrified of his temper, indulged his whims rather than risk defiance. Chroniclers describe Ibrahim releasing entire flocks of pigeons into his chambers or ordering the drowning of his concubines on a paranoid whim. Each act of excess further eroded the dignity of the dynasty, turning the empire's inner sanctum into a theatre of madness. The lesson is stark. The harem's rules were designed to bind desire with discipline to transform intimacy into an instrument of empire. But in the hands of a ruler like Ibrahim, the chains broke. Desire became compulsion, ritual became farce, and the empire itself paid the price. The mad sultan did not merely disgrace himself, he revealed how thin the line truly was between order and chaos, when the personal appetites of one man could bend an entire system to breaking. Desire within the harem was never spontaneous, never left to chance. It was administered with the precision of an accountant balancing ledgers. Every encounter with the sultan, every glance, every night, every possible consequence was logged by the palace treasury. Behind the jewelled doors of Topkapi intimacy became paperwork. The records were astonishingly detailed. The treasurer kept ledgers that listed the date of each encounter, the concubine's name, and even the outcome, whether pregnancy was suspected, whether satisfaction seemed achieved, whether the woman would return to the rotation. These diaries were not hidden or whispered. They were part of the state archive, as vital to the machinery of empire as tax rolls or military rosters. The purpose was simple but chilling. By treating the sultan's private life as state property, the empire ensured legitimacy. If a concubine bore a son, there would be no dispute about paternity. The ledger already marked the night of conception. If rival factions argued over succession, officials could pull the book from its shelf and point to the entry cold ink silencing warm rumour. Intimacy was transformed into evidence, but bureaucracy has its own cruelties. Consider the story of Gulf Kedin, one of Suleiman's wives. Her scheduled night with the Sultan was considered so valuable that she sold it to another concubine, a quiet transaction in the shadow economy of the harem. The exchange seemed harmless, two women reshuffling their place in a rigid system. Yet when the treasurer's ledger revealed the discrepancy, the punishment was swift and fatal. Gulf Kedin was executed. The message was unmistakable. A woman's body was not hers to bargain with. Access to the Sultan was not affection or privilege. It was state property, non-transferable and inviolable. In many ways, the system feels disturbingly familiar. Modern governments track births, marriages, and deaths with paperwork. Hospitals file records of fertility prescriptions, even intimacy, through medical codes. Corporations document our habits, preferences, and patterns with data points. In Topkapi, this logic was already alive, a belief that private life could be audited, verified, and controlled. The harem was a proto-bureaucracy of the body centuries before modern states perfected the art. For the women inside the diaries were another chain. Their nights became entries in a book, their emotions reduced to lines of ink. Love, if it dared to spark, could never be private. Every touch was shadowed by a scribe's hand, every sigh recorded, as if it belonged to the empire rather than to them. It was a world where even the most intimate moments carried the weight of politics, where the boundary between lover and subject dissolved, and where a woman's worth could be summed up in the stroke of a pen. The Sultan's chambers were not merely bedrooms, they were instruments of surveillance disguised as sanctuaries. To the untrained eye they shimmered with opulence, walls draped in silk fountains, murmuring in marble basins, Iznik tiles glowing in cobalt and emerald. Yet every curve, every angle, every window was calculated. Beauty here was never innocent. It was control wearing a mask. Hidden corridors threaded behind the walls, narrow as coffins where eunuchs could slip silently and watch through latticed screens. A woman might believe herself alone with the Sultan, but unseen eyes could measure her every gesture. Did she speak out of turn? Did she linger too long? Did she dare break the silence imposed upon her? Privacy was never hers to claim. It was a privilege granted and revoked by the architecture itself. The sight lines of the rooms were equally deliberate. Windows were placed not for light but for oversight. Slits cut high above eye level allowed guards to confirm compliance without entering. Even the shimmering tiles had a purpose beyond beauty. Their polished glaze created subtle reflections, turning walls into mirrors that betrayed movement. What seemed like ornamentation was in truth 1,000 watchful surfaces ensuring no secret could remain wholly secret. This was more than decoration. It was a psychology of power built in stone. To live in such chambers was to feel constantly observed, to sense the invisible gaze pressing upon your shoulders. It was the same principle later used in prisons and factories controlled through the suspicion of constant surveillance. Centuries before Jeremy Bentham would design his panopticon, the Ottomans had already perfected its logic in the Sultan's most intimate rooms. The paradox was cruel. The Sultan's bedchamber was supposed to be the empire's most private space, the one place where desire might slip free of politics. Yet its very walls betrayed that promise, turning love into performance intimacy, into theatre played before an unseen audience. Women entering those rooms learned quickly they were not stepping into privacy, but into a stage built for scrutiny. And so the architecture itself became a chain. A woman might press her palm to the cool tiles, admire the arabesque flowers swirling across the glaze, and for a moment imagine beauty untouched. But behind that beauty lay the true design, a palace that made even tenderness a monitored act where stone and tile conspired to remind her nothing here was ever her own. If the Sultan was the sun, then the Valide Sultan, his mother, was the moon that governed the tides of the harem. No concubine, no matter how dazzling, entered the Sultan's chambers without her approval. She presided over the invisible machinery of scheduling, the keeper of chart cycles and secrets. To outsiders, she appeared as a dignified matron in veils. To those inside, she was the axis around which the entire harem revolved. Her most famous tool was deceptively simple silk handkerchiefs. Each colour carried meaning as sharp as any decree. Gold-threaded silk meant immediate summons to the Sultan's bed. Crimson marked high favour but delayed entry. Blue or green suggested waiting, perhaps weeks, perhaps forever. A white handkerchief was the most dreaded of all, for it meant dismissal, a quiet fall from the Sultan's interest. To receive one was to know that the door to his chamber might never open again. Concubines lived in suspense of these small squares of fabric, their futures hanging on colour and thread. The ritual of distribution itself became theatre. The Valide Sultan, seated in majesty attendance, laying silks before her young women, trembling as their fates were handed down in cloth. A single handkerchief could elevate a woman to splendour or cast her into obscurity. But the Valide Sultan's power extended far beyond the walls of the harem. As the mother of the ruler, she was often the only figure who could speak to the Sultan, without bowing, the one whose voice could pierce the armour of imperial ceremony. She advised on appointments, interceded in disputes and in times of weakness, even directed state policy. European ambassadors wrote cautiously of her, recognizing that to win her favour could mean access to the empire's core. Some Valide sultans became legendary in their own right. Kusum Sultan, mother of Murad IV and Ibrahim, they effectively ruled the empire during her son's minority. Her network of alliances, her ability to balance factions, and her iron control of the harem made her one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Later, Turhan Sultan would oversee grand architectural projects, commissioning mosques and charitable foundations that reshaped Istanbul's skyline. To the concubines, however, she remained a figure of both awe and dread. She was gatekeeper and judge, benevolent to those who obeyed, merciless to those who crossed her. Her silks might look delicate, but in them lay sentences as final as the Sultan's seal. Thus, even in a palace that proclaimed male supremacy, the hand of a mother could tip the scales of empire. In the shadowed chambers of Topkapi, the Valide Sultan was proof that in a world built to silence women, power still found ways to speak softly, decisively, and often through the flutter of a handkerchief. If intimacy in the harem was scheduled like a military campaign, then beauty was its battlefield. The concubines' bodies became canvases on which the empire painted its ideals, and the cost of that perfection was measured in pain, poison, and quiet despair. Preparation for a night with the Sultan began days in advance. Women were confined in chambers heavy with incense, where attendants bathed them in perfumed waters until their skin glistened. Then came the cosmetics powders made with lead to whiten the face, mercury-based pastes to smooth the skin, charcoal and antimony to darken the eyes. The results were dazzling under lamplight, but each application carried slow poison. Lead seeped into the blood-eroding bone and teeth. Mercury gnawed at nerves, leaving tremors and madness in its wake. The very substances that made a woman desirable were the same that ensured her decline. Diets were equally cruel. Palace physicians prescribed regimes meant to keep bodies slender, hips narrow and bellies flat. Meals were reduced to fruits broth and measured grains, leaving women faint and dizzy. Some were forbidden water before their night, told that a hollowed stomach made their beauty sharper. Others were purged with bitter herbal concoctions that tore through their insides but pleased the eye of the beholder. The rituals went further still. Hot wax ripped away body hair, leaving burns and scars hidden beneath silk. Teeth were scrubbed with abrasive powders that stripped enamel. Hair was oiled and scented with rose and jasmine until it gleamed, but the heavy perfumes caused headaches and nausea. Beauty here was not indulgence, it was endurance. The psychological toll was no less punishing. Women learned that their value depended not on their words, their wit, or even their obedience, but on whether their skin reflected the lamplight just so, whether their figures matched a ruler's fleeting desire. The mirror became both ally and executioner. Each blemish was a threat, each wrinkle a prophecy of dismissal. In many ways, the harem foreshadowed a truth that echoes to this day: beauty as industry, beauty as currency. Then as now, women were promised reward if they conformed to impossible standards and punished often fatally when they could not. What was different in the harem was the scale of consequence. Here, failure did not mean social ridicule. It could mean exile, demotion, or even death. Behind the silks and jewels therefore lay an unspoken reality. Every woman summoned to the Sultan's side carried with her the scent of roses, yes, but also the faint metallic trace of lead powder. Every smile shimmered with beauty crafted by pain. Every gesture rehearsed against the fear that if her body faltered, she would vanish into the shadowed corridors of forgotten women. The journey to the Sultan's chambers was itself a ritual, a choreography of standards designed to remind a concubine of her place. It began in the communal dormitories where women lived side by side in quarters that resembled both convent and prison. From there a chosen woman was summoned and placed under the escort of eunuchs. The corridors she walked were unlike any others in the palace, narrow, dimly lit, curving in ways that disoriented newcomers. No window opened to the night skier, the path itself was meant to sever her from the outside world. The silence of this passage was total. Conversation was forbidden. Even the eunuch's sandals made little sound on the polished stone. The only noise was the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing faintly against walls lined with intricate tiles. Each step carried symbolism, leaving the crowded, watchful life of the harem for a temporary crossing into the Sultan's isolated domain. At certain points the route forked. Only the guards knew which turn led to the Sultan's chambers. For the concubine the path felt almost mystical, as though she were being drawn through a maze that had no map. By design, she never saw the same sequence of halls twice. In this way, the palace ensured that no woman could memorize the path well enough to return on her own, much less to escape. The ritual culminated in a final threshold, a gilded door flanked by attendants carrying perfumed torches. Here the concubine was bathed in light, her silks arranged one last time, her posture corrected. She was reminded not to speak unless commanded, not to meet the Sultan's eyes until permitted. These gestures were not merely etiquette. They were the silent language of submission practiced and perfected through years of training. The symbolism was unmistakable. The communal quarters she had left behind represented her lack of individuality, a body among hundreds. The winding guarded corridors represented control, a passage watched from every shadow. The opulent chamber at the end filled with carpets, furs, and the Sultan's presence was both reward and trap. In that gilded isolation she was elevated above her peers, but stripped of freedom more thoroughly than ever. It was a theatre of power, each step rehearsed in advance. And the concubine knew as the doors closed behind her that she had walked not just into a private room, but into the very heart of the Empire's machinery, a place where silence, submission, and ritual replaced intimacy, and where her own body would be absorbed into the performance of sovereignty. Once inside the Sultan's chambers, the night unfolded not as romance, but as theatre. Every gesture was scripted, every silence rehearsed. A concubine was trained from her earliest days in the harem to approach the Sultan at a precise angle, never turning her back to him, never allowing her hands to stray in ways that could be mistaken for concealment. Even in the bedchamber, assassination was feared. Intimacy itself was treated as a potential battlefield. The rituals dictated that she kneel before speaking, her eyes lowered until the Sultan gave permission to lift them. She was to remove her silks and choreographed order garments, falling like cues in a play, each layer timed to please the eye. The act of undressing was no different from a court mask designed to entertain, to symbolize surrender, to remind the Sultan that every thread of her being was under his command. During the encounter itself, silence ruled. A concubine was forbidden to laugh, to sigh, even to cry out in pain or pleasure, unless directly commanded. Her breathing was trained to remain steady, her face taught to hold a mask of serenity. Pleasure, if she felt it, had to be hidden. Displeasure, if it came, had to vanish behind calm submission. Emotion was dangerous, for it suggested an inner self the empire had not scripted. The required positions were as much about security as desire. A concubine was never allowed to be behind the Sultan, or in a posture where her hands could move unseen. Even the arrangement of the bedchamber reflected this paranoia, cushions and lamps placed to ensure visibility from every angle. The Sultan was not simply a lover. He was a ruler who knew that enemies might strike at his most vulnerable moment. And so even lovemaking became an act of vigilance. The parallels with theatre were unmistakable. The harem trained women as actors in a play staged nightly for one spectator. They rehearsed their lines, whispers of poetry, fragments of song. They learned when to pause, when to smile, when to freeze into silence. Every encounter was a performance meant to flatter, arouse, and reassure. Like performers, they could not break character without risking disgrace, but unlike actresses, they were never free to leave the stage. When the lamps dimmed and the curtains of the chamber closed, the play began whether or not their hearts were in it. Intimacy became illusion, a carefully constructed drama in which love was outlawed and humanity suppressed. And the cruelest truth of all, the Sultan himself may have known it. Surrounded by actors, he could never be sure which gestures were real and which were learned. His chamber was a theatre in which every night was scripted, and he, the most powerful man in the empire, was at once the audience, the director, and the prisoner of his own stage. When the encounter ended, the concubine's night was not over. No gentle rest, no quiet moment of recovery was permitted. As soon as she rose from the Sultan's bed, attendants entered, with the efficiency of officials closing a ledger. Eunuchs escorted her away, while palace physicians and midwives descended upon her body with the same detachment one might reserve for livestock. The examinations began within hours. Her pulse was taken, her body inspected, her womb scrutinized for the earliest signs of pregnancy. This was not biz care, it was surveillance. The concubine's flesh was no longer hers, it was a potential vessel for dynastic succession and therefore property of the state. The intimacy she had just endured was immediately reframed as a medical and political event. What followed was documentation of almost obsessive detail. Scribes recorded the duration of the encounter, the positions used, even the Sultan's apparent satisfaction. The records did not veil their language in poetry, they catalogued the act as if it were an agricultural report. Over time, these volumes became archives of preference, a database of desire. Future concubines would be trained according to these entries, adjusting their performance to align with what pleased the ruler most. The implications were staggering. A woman's most private experiences, moments of vulnerability, of endurance, of forced passion, were stripped of humanity and converted into political capital. If a son was conceived, the record proved his legitimacy. If no child came, the record justified new strategies, more nights assigned. New concubines rotated in diets and treatments adjusted like experiments. The body became laboratory, archive, and battlefield all at once. For these women, this routine deepened the sense that they were not partners in intimacy, but instruments of empire. To be examined so quickly after leaving the Sultan's arms was to be reminded that their worth lay not in affection, not in memory, but in their biological utility. Even the smallest trace of tenderness was erased by the cold ink of record-keeping. The cruelty lay in its banality. No executioner's blade, no open display of violence, just clerks, physicians, and ledgers reducing human beings into statistics of satisfaction. The harem's greatest act of dehumanization was not in its punishments but in its paperwork. In the end, it was not passion or even survival that defined a woman's legacy here, but the entry written beside her name in a book she would never be allowed to see. In the harem, the most dangerous crime was not disobedience nor even betrayal, it was love. Genuine affection for the Sultan, unguarded, uncalculated, unperformed, was treated as treason. A concubine who dared to show her heart risked immediate exile, imprisonment, or death. The reasoning was ruthless but consistent. To love meant to prioritize emotion over empire. A woman who truly loved might plead with the Sultan to spare a condemned man to alter a campaign to favor one child over another. Love in this logic was not a gift but a threat, a rival authority whispering in the ruler's ear, more persuasive than any vizier. And so to protect the machinery of state intimacy had to be reduced to performance. Real emotion was outlawed. The human cost was immense. Palace records and travellers' tales hint at tragedies buried beneath silks. There was Aisha, a concubine who reportedly wept openly when the Sultan left her chambers. Within days, she vanished from the rotation, reassigned to distant quarters, never again summoned. Another tale speaks of a young Circassian girl who secretly exchanged poems with the ruler. When discovered, both her verses and her body were burned, a warning that no written word of love could outlive the empire's suspicion. Even Hurrem Sultan, who defied so many laws, was accused by her rivals of crossing this forbidden boundary. Yet she survived where others perished, not because she was spared affection, but because she disguised it in politics, presenting her devotion as strategy, her tenderness as loyalty to the throne. Love to endure had to wear the mask of calculation. For most women, the result was emotional mutilation. They were trained to suppress natural longing, to hide any flicker of joy or grief. To smile too warmly, to linger too long with the Sultan was to invite suspicion. And so they learned to hollow themselves to become actresses of desire, while burying their true feelings deep inside where no observer could reach. The wider truth is stark. In the harem, power and intimacy could not coexist. To love was to risk death to desire, was to court exile to feel, was to forfeit survival. The empire demanded submission not only of body but of heart, stripping away the one thing that could have made this gilded prison bearable. Thus the greatest cruelty of all was not the poisons in the cosmetics nor the lash of punishment, but this, the knowledge that the most human act, love, was the one forbidden luxury. In Topkapi's marble halls, affection itself was a crime, and the women who dared to feel it became martyrs to a system that prized control above all else. If the harem was a prison, it was one where the walls were not only stone but human. The system thrived on betrayal. Senior concubines were tasked with watching the younger ones, noting every slip of protocol, every whisper that strayed beyond permitted topics. Juniors were encouraged, even rewarded for reporting on their elders' failings. Loyalty to one another was poisoned before it had a chance to take root. The design was intentional. A community of women united in their suffering might have resisted the empire's chains. They might have shielded one another, or plotted escapes, or confronted the Sultan's mother with demands. But suspicion splintered them into fragments. No confidences could be trusted. A laugh shared in the baths, a secret spoken in the dormitories could return as a dagger in the form of accusation. The psychological warfare was relentless. Women were forced to live as both rivals and informants, competing for the Sultan's favour, while fearing the betrayal of their closest companions. The result was a climate where envy and paranoia replaced solidarity. A concubine's fall was often another's rise, and the palace ensured that each collapse was visible enough to remind the others survival meant standing alone. Ottoman chroniclers noted the whisper networks that flourished in the harem, chains of rumour that spread faster than smoke. These whispers were as lethal as swords for the Valide Sultan, and her officials listened closely. A careless word could be magnified into treason. A hint of affection, a rumour of disobedience became justification for removal. The women themselves became the tools of their own oppression, turning on one another in hopes of survival. It was a microcosm of empire itself. Just as provinces were kept loyal by playing rivals against each other, the harem kept its hundreds of women compliant by ensuring they never trusted their neighbours. Fear not chains kept the system intact. And the tragedy is clear. Within those marble walls were women who might have found friendship, sisterhood, even love among one another. Instead, they lived in a hall of mirrors, never certain if the reflection smiling back was ally or spy. The empire's greatest triumph was not the silencing of women's voices, but the teaching of women to silence themselves and each other. Even desire in the Ottoman palace moved with the calendar. The Sultan's intimate life was not left to whim, but followed rhythms as predictable as the planting of fields or the turning of stars. Palace records reveal that his preferences often shifted with the seasons, his concubine choices reflecting not just personal taste, but the great cycle of empire itself. In spring, during the season of renewal, he often favoured younger women, symbols of fertility and rebirth. summoned during festivals that celebrated growth and abundance. As tulips bloomed in the palace gardens, the harem became a mirror of the world outside, fresh faith, lighter silks, music filled with joy. Summer nights, long and heavy with heat, often saw the Sultan seek dancers and musicians, women, whose energy matched the exuberance of feasts and outdoor celebrations. Autumn with its harvest rituals brought a quieter, more reflective intimacy. Records speak of the Sultan turning to older, more trusted favourites during this season, women who offered conversation as well as companionship, as if echoing the wisdom of gathering what the year had sown. And in the deep chill of winter, his taste shifted again toward women of fuller figure, symbols of warmth and abundance chosen to banish the cold. These rhythms were not coincidental. They echoed the empire's religious and agricultural calendars. Festivals such as Ramadan and Eid imposed periods of abstinence or heightened ritual during which intimacy was reshaped by piety. Major military campaigns launched in spring and summer meant that autumn was a season of return when the Sultan, weary from war, sought comfort in familiar arms. Even his desires then were woven into the fabric of empire, turning the private into an extension of the public. To the concubines, this meant their fortunes rose and fell with the seasons. A woman celebrated in May might find herself forgotten by October. Others dismissed for months could be suddenly recalled when their season returned. The harem's administrators tracked these patterns with meticulous care, adjusting training diets and schedules to ensure that when the Sultan's seasonal hunger shifted, the right women were ready. Sexuality thus became ritualized, tied not only to the Sultan's moods, but to the cycles of nature and faith that governed his empire. Desire was no longer merely personal, it was calendrical, a performance that aligned the ruler's body with the rhythm of the state. And so even in the most intimate chambers of Topkapi, the seasons made themselves felt. A concubine could look at the garden's blossoms or the frost on the latticed windows and know her fate. For in this world even love was scheduled by the calendar, and passion itself was bent to the empire's rhythm. Before a concubine ever saw the Sultan's chambers, she passed through years of training designed to erase who she had been and rebuild her into what the empire required. For 2 years she lived under a regimen as strict as any soldier's, though her battlefield was the Sultan's heart and body. The curriculum was exhaustive. She learned languages, Arabic, Persian, sometimes even Italian or Greek, so she could sing poems, recite verses, or converse if commanded. She was trained in music, playing instruments whose notes might soothe or entice. She memorized entire anthologies of love poetry, each line ready to spill from her lips as if it were spontaneous. But beneath these arts lay the most guarded lessons, the intimate arts, a coded phrase for techniques of seduction, observation, and obedience. Older concubines, their youth long behind them, became instructors. They taught not love, but theatre, how to read a man's face for signs of anger or delight, how to feign passionate will, how to maintain serenity even in discomfort. Graduation came not with diplomas, but with examinations as invasive as they were humiliating. Before a panel of senior women, a candidate demonstrated her skills in simulated encounters, her posture, her undressing, her performance of submission critiqued with clinical detail. Success meant entry into the Sultan's rotation. Failure meant relegation to service work, her dreams of influence extinguished before they began. Dietary regulations further reminded her that even her stomach belonged to the empire. Palace physicians imposed meal plans timed to menstrual cycles designed to increase or suppress fertility depending on political need. Certain foods, garlic, onions, spices, were banned lest they alter the scent or taste of the body. Others were forced upon the women, figs for fertility, almonds for vitality. Hunger was as much a tool of conditioning as language drills or music lessons. The clothing codes reinforced the hierarchy. Favoured women wore silks from China, their garments embroidered with gold. Lesser concubines received simpler cloth colours, signalling their rank like banners in battle. Undressing before the Sultan was no spontaneous act. It was ritualized, a choreographed stripping away of layers, each fold of fabric removed at a precise moment to heighten the spectacle. In this theatre, the body itself became the stage. What emerged from these years of discipline was not an individual but a role. A concubine was trained to be whoever the Sultan desired, to erase her true self behind masks of beauty, wit, and silence. Her laughter, her gestures, her very appetite were rehearsed until authenticity disappeared. Dehumanization was not a byproduct, it was the purpose. By the time she graduated, she had become less a woman than an instrument tuned for performance. And yet traces of individuality sometimes survived. In secret, women whispered songs from their homelands, shared forbidden recipes, or passed down charms from mothers they barely remembered. These small acts of memory were resistance fragile reminders that beneath the costumes and choreography still lived human souls. But the system was designed to crush even those sparks. The harem turned its women into living theatre, and the play was endless, repeated every night under the flicker of oil lamps until the curtain fell not by choice, but by age or death. For more than 6 centuries the system endured. From the first Ottoman rulers in the 14th century until the empire's collapse in 1922, the harem remained a theatre where intimacy was weaponized, controlled and recorded like tax or war. Generations of women passed through its marble corridors, each one living under the same chains, each one learning that their worth was measured not in love, but in obedience. Even as the world outside shifted the Renaissance in Europe, the Mughal splendor in India, the Enlightenment with its proclamations of liberty, the Ottoman harem maintained its grip. The rituals grew more elaborate, the records more meticulous, the architecture more cunning. Desire became not a human spark, but a mechanism of state calibrated and perfected across centuries. Yet the system left behind more than ledgers and palaces. It carved scars into memory. Daughters of concubines grew up watching their mother's affection transformed into calculation. Eunuchs who enforced the rules passed down the culture of suspicion to their successors. Entire communities learned to survive by silence, by mistrust, by the suppression of self. The harem was dismantled when their empire finally crumbled, but the habits it fostered, the fear of intimacy, the belief that love was dangerous, lingered like smoke long after the fire had burned out. And what of the women themselves? Few names survive. Hurrem, Sultan Kuzem, Turhan, exceptions carved into chronicles because their influence spilled beyond the walls. But thousands more remained faceless, their stories lost in the archives, remembered only as numbers in ledgers or as rumours in travellers' tales. Their anonymity is the sharpest proof of how thoroughly the system consumed them. The legacy of the harem is not only a lesson in Ottoman history, it is a mirror held up to power itself. When rulers treat the most intimate parts of life as instruments of control, when love becomes treason and beauty becomes torture, what remains of humanity? The story of the harem is not just about concubines in silks, it is about how quickly any society can normalize cruelty when it is codified, ritualized and hidden behind beauty. The quiet historians would say, remember the mechanism, name it out loud, and refuse its next invitation. For power does not always announce itself with armies or decrees. Sometimes it comes in the form of rituals that feel natural traditions, that seem harmless rules, that sound inevitable. Sometimes it comes in the silken cadence of a chamber where a woman is forbidden to love. The Ottoman harem is gone, its corridors now part of a museum. Tourists walk the tiled halls, marvelling at the mosaics photographing the domes. Few hear the echoes, but if you pause, if you listen past the footfalls and the guide's rehearsed stories, you might catch a whisper, the breath of women who lived under invisible chains, who remind us still that the most dangerous corruption is not of politics or law, but of the human heart. The story of the Ottoman harem is not merely a chapter of exotic intrigue or architectural wonder. It is a reminder of how systems of power can reach into the most intimate corners of life, reshaping not only politics, but the very definition of love, beauty, and trust. For 6 centuries, the empire turned desire into state policy. Nights were scheduled, emotions forbidden, and affection itself declared treason. Women were trained to perform rather than to feel, to survive by silence rather than by honesty. And yet when we strip away the marble corridors and jewelled silks, what remains is a truth that resonates across time. Whenever intimacy is subordinated to control, humanity itself begins to erode. The harem is not simply a relic of Ottoman history. It is a mirror warning us how easily cruelty can be normalized when it is wrapped in ritual and made to seem inevitable. The lessons are sobering. First, mistrust as policy always corrodes the human spirit. The deliberate cultivation of betrayal inside the harem destroyed solidarity, just as fear-driven systems today fracture communities and isolate individuals. Where suspicion thrives, compassion dies. Second, the weaponization of beauty shows us the dangers of chasing ideals that demand self-destruction. Lead powders, starvation diets, ritualized pain. These were the prices concubines paid for survival. Today we see echoes in industries that profit from insecurity, convincing people to harm themselves in pursuit of impossible perfection. The harem reminds us to question who benefits when beauty becomes torment. Third love cannot flourish where power demands performance. In the harem, genuine affection was punished because it threatened the state's control. Outside the palace, the lesson holds when relationships, whether personal or professional, are built on fear masks or constant performance. They suffocate the possibility of real connection. Trust and tenderness require freedom. Without it, they wither. Finally, history teaches us the importance of naming mechanisms aloud. The harem endured because its rules were accepted as tradition, unchallenged for centuries. Only when individuals like Sultan defied them did cracks appear. In our own lives, systems of control, whether in institutions, workplaces, or even families, often hide behind the language of custom or necessity. To resist them, we must first recognize them, then choose differently. The marble walls of Topkapi now stand silent, their chambers walked by tourists rather than guarded by eunuchs. But the echoes linger not as gossip from an exotic past, but as questions we must ask ourselves. Where are we still trading dignity for proximity to power? Where are we normalizing cruelty because it comes draped in ceremony? Where are we mistaking performance for love? History offers no easy comfort, but it offers clarity. The harem's long shadow reminds us that the most precious freedoms are not won on battlefields, but preserved in the spaces closest to the heart. To guard those spaces, to keep love honest, beauty humane, and trust unbroken, is perhaps the deepest lesson we can take from the empire's most secret rooms. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.